Hello, everyone. Oh, it's so good to see all of you in here today. I tell you what, today is all about Frank Lloyd Wright. I tell you, I did some research on him, and to my surprise, this man was brilliant, talented. Not only was he an architect, he was a designer, a writer, and an educator. And I tell you what, we are honored today to have the travel manager, Erin, here to tell us more about Taliesin and Frank Lloyd Wright. So give her a warm welcome because she's got a lot of information for us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. As Janice said, my name is Erin. I'm the tour manager at Taliesin Preservation. I've been giving tours for 5 years there, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright's time in Wisconsin, as well as take you on a virtual tour of his home and property in Spring Green. Like Janice said, Frank Lloyd Wright was a prolific architect, designer. He had a school he called the Fellowship, and he did a lot of things. We don't have time to cover all of his things, but we will cover as much as possible today. My organization, Taliesin Preservation, has a dual mission of education as well as raising money to provide preservation of Taliesin, of the building. And together we like to ask our guests, how might we live now? Because we want to continue Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy of thinking outside the box, of thinking about how the built environment impacts our feelings and how we interact with the natural environment as well. Before we can jump into talking about Frank Lloyd Wright, though, we need to go back in time a little bit and talk about the Wyoming Valley in Spring Green. It all comes back to this. This is part of the Driftless region, which I think heavily influenced Frank Lloyd Wright's design aesthetic. He was really concerned about having buildings fit in with the nature that surrounds them as part of his theories of organic architecture. And the way he became introduced to this area was through his family. Frank Lloyd Wright's grandparents, the Lloyd Joneses, came from Wales in the 1800s, and they settled in the Wyoming Valley in the 1860s, along with 8 of their 11 children. And they all had a farmstead out in that area. So as a child, Frank Lloyd Wright would go out there for the summer, and he would spend a lot of his time doing farming with his uncles. This was not something young Frank Lloyd Wright particularly enjoyed. He often tried to go and explore the valley instead of doing his farm work. And I think that really influenced his ideas about nature and design. This is something that brought Frank Lloyd Wright back continually throughout his lifetime. He said that Wisconsin, and particularly the Wyoming Valley, pulled him back like a rubber band. He would always continue to go back to that place. All right, so there we go. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in 1867. To put that in a little bit of context, just a couple of years after the end of the Civil War. And he passed away in 1959, shortly before the space race began. So his life covered a lot of interesting time periods and events. In Richland Center, he actually does have a building, but it's not a building associated with him being born there. It's a warehouse called, the 80 German Warehouse. And Wright actually studied engineering at UW-Madison, but he didn't technically graduate. He decided he wanted to be an architect and he did not want to be an engineer. So he dropped out of UW-Madison and took a train down to Chicago and tried to get a job as an architect. So he eventually would start working for a friend of his uncle's, Joseph Lyman Silsby. And then after that, he worked very closely with Louis Sullivan and apprenticed with him. And that's sort of how he trained, on-the-job learning. And learning by doing is sort of a theme throughout Frank Lloyd Wright's life. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. His career spanned about 70 years. He started architecture when he was about 18 years old, and he never retired. He passed away when he was 91. He designed over 1,100 buildings, and about half of those were built. So around 500 buildings ever existed that Wright designed. When Wright built Taliesin, he was in his mid-40s. This was in 1911, and he had been an architect for a little over 20 years at that point, mainly out of his studio in Oak Park, Illinois, where he had a home as well. He lived there with his wife. Her name was Catherine Tobin, and together they had 6 children. But he was involved in somewhat of a scandal. He started dating someone who was not his wife. Her name was Mama Borthwick, and she was actually the wife of one of his clients. Because of the scandal, they decided to flee the United States. They went to Europe for a while, mainly Italy. And when they returned to the United States, they built Taliesin in Spring Green, in part to avoid some of the scandal that was still following them. Taliesin had 2 fires, one in 1914 and one in 1925, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Wright would never marry Mama, but he would marry another woman named Miriam Noel, and that relationship didn't last very long. And then eventually in 1924, he met his 3rd wife, Olga Vanna, and she was the one who helped him launch his architectural fellowship in the 1930s, 1932. Taliesin itself is an 800-acre home, studio, and farm. So as an adult, Frank Lloyd Wright really appreciated that farming he did as a child. And when he built Taliesin, he conceived of it as being a home and a studio with a garden and a farm behind it. So agriculture was always a big part of Taliesin. Taliesin is also the name of both Wright's home and his property, so it's a little confusing, but when I say that, I'm talking about both things. Frank Lloyd Wright, eventually throughout his lifetime in the Spring Green Valley, he would acquire about 2,700 acres of property. Today, the estate is about 800 acres, and it includes the Taliesin home as well as a barn complex called the Midway Barn, a windmill called Romeo and Juliet, the Hillside Studio and Theater, a home Wright built for his sister Jane called Tannadary. There's a couple little cottages that were originally a chicken coop and a tool shed and eventually became Frank Lloyd Wright tiny homes. And we also have our building where we base our tours out of the Frank Lloyd Wright Visitor Center, which was a restaurant Wright designed, and it would have been called Riverview Terrace. Frank Lloyd Wright, like I mentioned, he developed the Taliesin Fellowship in the 1930s, and this was something that was in part a response to what was happening in the world at the time, and that was the Great Depression. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't have a lot of commissions coming in at the time, and so he was having some issues with money. He didn't have a lot of income to pay his source of labor on his farm and the people who were building his buildings. So the Taliesin Fellowship kind of solved both of those problems. It was a way to bring some income in. He charged a tuition. It was about $800 the first year, I believe. And he also used his students as a source of labor. So they were required to do 4 hours of work a day, either that be out in the farm fields or helping to construct and preserve his home. And he also converted the school that he built for his aunts into the hub for the fellowship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on as well. Like I mentioned, he built over 500 structures throughout the world. And in 1976, Taliesin was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 2019, Taliesin was also named part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called the 20th Century Architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, and it includes 8 Wright sites. Taliesin, Unity Temple, which is in Illinois, the Roby House, Falling Water in Pennsylvania, the Guggenheim Museum, Jacobs One, which is in Madison, and Taliesin West in Arizona, as well as a house called Hollyhock out in California. So all of those together make the one UNESCO site. There are only about 1,200 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the world, and only 26 of those are in the United States. So it's a huge honor to be part of that list that kind of puts Taliesin on par with things like the Great Wall of China, Stonehenge, Yellowstone National Park, and it's right here in our backyard. It's actually the only public UNESCO site in Wisconsin. The Jacobs House is privately owned still. We talked a little bit about the valley, but the landscape was just as important to Frank Lloyd Wright as the buildings themselves. And that's sort of going back to his time spent in the valley as a child. Here we have a picture of the dam. Frank Lloyd Wright put in a dam and a waterfall in 1912. And this was in part because he loved water features. And even though Taliesin is right next to the Wisconsin River, there's not a great view of the Wisconsin River from Taliesin. So Wright sought to fix that by building his own water garden. He also put a hydraulic ram on the dam, which pushed water up the hill to Taliesin. So he did have running water right from the very beginning. And in the 1920s, he put a hydroelectric generator on the dam. So he was very ahead of his time in terms of renewable energy. And also, he had electricity about 10 years before anyone else in the valley would. Most of the rural parts of that part of Wisconsin didn't get electricity until 1937. So Frank Lloyd Wright, again, being way ahead of his time. Also in the valley, not technically part of the property, is what's called Unity Chapel. And this was something that was actually designed by Wright's first mentor, Joseph Lyman Silsbee. His grandparents and aunts and uncles were Unitarian, and they wanted to have their own little chapel in the valley. So Joseph Lyman Silsbee built that for him, and at the time that it was built, Frank Lloyd Wright was only 18 years old. So he wasn't allowed to do the design of the chapel itself, but we think he did have a hand in designing what the interior looks like. This is still a chapel that belongs to the Lloyd-Jones family. So they're still in the area, and they still use this for events once in a while. If you were to go over to Unity Chapel, you would see Frank Lloyd Wright's headstone, which is the picture you can see on the left there. He designed his own headstone, and he also put the wrong birthday on his headstone. So if you were to go there, you would see that it says he was born in 1869. And he did that because he wanted it to seem a little more impressive when he was younger, because it made him seem like he was a younger architect that was doing all of these amazing things. So that is why he was saying that about his age. There's also a home in the valley called Tanadery, and this was the home that Frank Lloyd Wright built for his sister Jane. She actually moved to the valley in 1908, a few years before Wright himself did. And Tanadery is a type of home that Wright was advertising in the Ladies' Home Journal as a $5,000 fireproof home. And what made it fireproof is the cinder blocks that would have been on the outside, because this was typically for a more urban environment. So the cinder blocks would have fit in pretty seamlessly with a city. However, he wanted the house to fit in with the country setting, so he put wood on the outside, so no longer technically fireproof. And what makes this an interesting home is that Jane told Frank Lloyd Wright, I don't want one of your weird experiments. I want a normal home. Just please give me something that's traditional. So this is a more open concept version of a traditional style home. And the name Tanadery itself is actually Welsh, going back to the grandparents, and it means under the oaks. So the area that this is located in the valley was an oak savanna, basically a prairie dotted with some big oak trees. So that is how that got its name. Here we have a picture of the interior of Tanadery on the left. You can see how nice and open it feels in there. And there's also a view of the porch that wasn't a part of the original design, but Wright wanted to give his sister a nice outdoor space to enjoy. And there's actually a really nice view of Taliesin itself from Tanadery, so they can look at each other across the valley there, even though it's about a mile away. All right, and here we have Taliesin, the home itself. The picture that you're seeing on the left is sort of the front of the home that is facing off of the hill. And you see a really long, kind of skinny terrace there. That's called the bird walk. That bird walk wasn't installed until the 1950s, and I feel like when you see a picture of that, you know you're looking at Taliesin. It's so iconic, but it's something that didn't come in until almost the end of Frank Lloyd Wright's lifetime. Taliesin was not something that Frank Lloyd Wright ever considered to be a completed building. It is not like how he did his clients' homes, where it would be a nice, polished, high-end materials, very complete for them to live in. Frank Lloyd Wright thought of Taliesin as a place where he could experiment. It was a living laboratory, and so something was always under construction at Taliesin. This is also the third version of Taliesin. I mentioned that there were 2 fires in the home. The first fire in 1914 is the fire that is more famous. You might already know about it, and that's because it was actually an act of arson and murder. We do not know why, but one of Frank Lloyd Wright's employees, after serving lunch to everybody, actually set fire to the home, and he murdered Frank Lloyd Wright's partner, Mama, her 2 young children, and 4 other people. So 7 people were killed that day. It was a huge tragedy, both, in terms of them losing their lives, and also Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a huge personal tragedy for him. He lost the love of his life. He lost the home he built for the love of his life. And he went into an almost year-long depression after the first fire happened. He eventually resolved to rebuild in Mama's honor. So in 1915, Wright completed Taliesin 2. Then about 10 years later, 1925, there was an electrical fire. So unfortunately, Wright's innovation in terms of having electricity at his home was to his detriment because it started a fire and he lost the second version, but he rebuilt in 1925. So we're actually in the few weeks here coming up on the 100th anniversary of that second fire. The name Taliesin, like Tanaderry, is a Welsh word, and for Frank Lloyd Wright, it meant shining brow, like the brow of your forehead. And that's because Wright didn't actually put the home on top of the hill. He wanted to enjoy both the hill and the home together. So he felt by putting the home on the brow of the hill, he could not lose that hill. That hill was significant to Frank Lloyd Wright because it was his favorite place to go hang out while he was avoiding some of that farm work from his uncles. Here you can see a better picture of the top of the hill, which Wright referred to as the hill crown, and you can kind of see how the building surrounds the hill crown. This area is known as the garden court, and originally this is where a driveway came through because this was a time when cars were not very common to begin with. But eventually in 1925 he decided to put the garden court here because he didn't want cars with the noise and exhaust coming so close to his front door. He also has a T-circle. You can sort of see up those stairs, there's a little semicircular stone area, and Frank Lloyd Wright and the apprentices liked to have tea every day at 4 o'clock. They would often have it on the T-circle. And even though it's named for something Wright was doing with the apprentices, this is one of the older features of Taliesin. So he always had a place to go and sit on his favorite hill. We also have a picture of some trellises. I often get asked what that scaffolding is, but Frank Lloyd Wright was upcycling, recycling before we had terms to describe those things. These are things that would have been cow stanchions, water pipes, and he constructed them to form trellises that would hold the vines to climb up the wall. Because vines can damage buildings, we no longer let the vines grow there. Our goal is to preserve Taliesin, but you can still see the trellises today. Here we have one of our residents. His name is Percy, and there are actually people who still live at Taliesin. Percy is one of them. And you can see another little water feature in the other picture, which was originally the horse trough that was sort of associated with where the carriages would drop people off at Taliesin. And when Wright converted that garden court, he wanted the sound of running water a little bit closer to his home, and he converted it into the water fountain. We can also see in the picture with Percy, there's a red square up there, and Frank Lloyd Wright actually made some ceramic tiles with the red square, which was his symbol, the red square, and he put his initials in that red square and then signed many of his buildings with them. So he's put his signature on his own home. The visitor center also has one, and there are about 20 or so other buildings that do as well. Here we have the agricultural wing. So as I mentioned, Frank Lloyd Wright was farming at Taliesin, and agriculture was something that was important there to him right from the very beginning. So Frank Lloyd Wright actually had his pig pen, which is the picture on the right, the curved red grate, that's actually attached to the residential wing via the roof line. You do have to go outside to get from place to place, but it is an integral part of the house. The picture that's on the left are some areas that were horse stables. It was called the work court, and this was a space that was pretty messy, mixing plaster, cutting lumber, but you can still see that it has a lot of design to it. It's still very beautiful, even though it was a very useful space. Here we have sort of a continuation of the agricultural wing. This is up on top of the hill, and the tallest part is called the Belvedere. The Belvedere is basically a lookout tower. Belvedere is an Italian term for beautiful view. So it actually provides a view of the valley while looking out over the residential wing. That was eventually converted into housing for Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices. And that would be the case with a lot of the agricultural areas at Taliesin itself. That's because he quickly outgrew those spaces and built a different barn called the Midway Barn Complex. So they were no longer being used for agriculture, and he took the opportunity to make them a little more useful to his needs at the time. This was also an area of the home that had a private dining room for Frank Lloyd Wright and his third wife, Olga, as well as a dining room for the apprentices, and there was a commercial kitchen back in this space so that they could cook for all of the people who were coming there. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted Taliesin to be a home and a studio in addition to being a garden and a farm. And so he had a personal drafting studio, much like his home in Oak Park, Illinois. And the space kind of with the chairs toward the fireplace is the original part of the room, but he expanded twice. And so by the time of that second fire, he'd expanded out to kind of what we see today. The big stone area on the right-hand side was a fireproof safe. And that was actually an exterior feature of Taliesin very early on. And so when Wright pushed the studio out, he incorporated that into the space. That's where he would have kept a lot of his plans and also his artwork. Wright collected a lot of art from China and Japan. When Wright enclosed the fireproof safe, he added a little stairway as well as a storage area up on top. Somehow, at some point, they managed to get a piano up there. There's actually pictures of, historic pictures of the top of the piano sticking out over the top of the wall there. And this was a space that Wright continued to use throughout his time at Taliesin, even though he also built another drafting studio for his apprentices in the 1930s. Here's another view of that main room of the studio. You can see pretty prominently one of Wright's art pieces here. It's a 6-fold Japanese screen. It's a couple hundred years old, and it's called Pine Trees with Pheasants and Ducks. We also have a table that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. Most of the furniture at Taliesin these days are things that were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And so this was his desk, that table on the left-hand side. And Frank Lloyd Wright would not have it anywhere as neat as we experience it today. In all of the historic photos, there are piles of books and papers and plants and objects and all sorts of things. This was his workspace. Something that's a little surprising about his desk and about a lot of the furniture at Taliesin is that they were made out of plywood. And plywood is not something that we typically think of as being a really nice building material, but it was a new material during Frank Lloyd Wright's lifetime. And so he could experiment with it. He could, use it to do many different things he wasn't able to do with other materials that he'd had in the past. And it was also a little higher quality than we have today while still being pretty inexpensive. So Wright really loved plywood and used a lot of it. There's a great story about the drafting studio, and it has to do with Frank Lloyd Wright's design of Falling Water. Falling Water is probably one of Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous buildings. It's in Pennsylvania, and it's built over the top of a waterfall. And the client, Edgar Kaufman Sr., had talked to Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright had gone out to Pennsylvania. He had taken elevations, photographs, notes. He had all of the materials that he needed to design Falling Water. And he came back to Wisconsin, and then 9 months went by and nothing happened. Until one day, Edgar Kaufman Sr. called Frank Lloyd Wright up and said, "Hey, I'm in Milwaukee. Can I come see the plans to my house?" And Frank Lloyd Wright said, "Sure, yeah, come on up, no problem." He then came out of his office, told his apprentices to sharpen his pencils and keep them coming. And while Kaufman was on the way from Milwaukee, Wright basically just drew for about 2.5 hours. And Kaufman arrives, Frank Lloyd Wright goes out to greet him. "We've been waiting for you." No indication of all of the activity that had happened right before that. Frank Lloyd Wright shows the plans to Kaufman of Falling Water, and Kaufman's a little bit surprised because he thought that he was going to get a nice, lovely view of the waterfall on his property. But Frank Lloyd Wright had other ideas and put that over the waterfall and incorporated it into the house. About 90% of what Frank Lloyd Wright drew in those 2.5 hours is what was physically built in Pennsylvania. So that gives you a little bit of an idea into Frank Lloyd Wright's work process. He said he didn't sit down to design buildings. He sat down to draw them. Kind of meaning he'd already designed it in his head, and all he needed to do was put it on paper. He would also say things like, "I just shook that one out of my sleeve." So this was kind of a little insight into the way that Frank Lloyd Wright's mind worked. The architecture was just already there. Moving on to Frank Lloyd Wright's residential wing, we have the living room here, and because of the fires, this is actually the third version of the living room. But it's always been an entertaining space. It's always been a space that Wright wanted to feel nice and open. And he didn't want you to feel too claustrophobic in this space, so he did some things to help open it up. He felt that if you separated every room with doors and walls, then it wouldn't be an inviting space. And so here we have a dining area in with a living area, which is a thing that a lot of us have in our home these days, in the modern times. But this was something that Frank Lloyd Wright was on the forefront of. This open layout concept was something that he had to invent, basically. The living room was a space where a lot of entertaining would happen, both with guests, but also the fellowship itself. The fellowship had a very strong sense of culture. They were not just developing new architects, they were trying to develop the whole individual. And so as part of that culture, they would have a formal meal every Sunday. And a lot of the times the meal would take place in the living room. The benches that are along the walls have little tables there, and those would actually become part of the place settings for the apprentices. They were meant to hold 2 place settings along with some silverware, so everybody would share those. The view that you can see out of Frank Lloyd Wright's living room, Frank Lloyd Wright said that the view out over the valley was so beautiful he didn't need to put art on the walls. All he needed to do was frame the view. And the view is framed in such a way that it actually invites you to sit in the living room and sort of relax and also be one with nature. He wanted you to feel like you were swinging out over the edge of the home onto the valley itself. There's a little breakfast nook toward the back, and that's where the bird walk sort of connects from the inside. And the bird walk was something that Wright's third wife, Olga, wanted. She said something around the breakfast table one day, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could walk among the birds?" And you can't really say something like that to someone with a mind like Frank Lloyd Wright, because next thing you know, he decided to build a terrace for her that went into the tops of the trees so she could literally walk among the birds. Here we have another view of Frank Lloyd Wright's living room. You can see, even though the view out over the valley was beautiful, he did put art on the walls. Frank Lloyd Wright started collecting artwork from China and Japan when he was about 18 years old and continued to do so throughout his life. He would eventually also travel to Japan and China as well. He did a hotel in Tokyo called the Imperial Hotel, so he did actually do some international work as well as work all throughout this country. Frank Lloyd Wright also has a Bechstein piano in his living room, and he had this entertaining space as part of the living room. Wright himself played piano. He learned from a very early age from his father, and so he collected pianos and other keyed instruments. He also said something along the lines of, if he hadn't become the world's greatest architect, he would have become the world's greatest piano player. There's to the left of the piano is also a weird-looking structure, and that is actually a music stand that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. He thought those metal music stands that you often see were pretty ugly, and so he wanted to improve that. This stand is made out of plywood, and it's meant for a string quartet. So 4 people can sit all around there and play at once. Now we can see a better view of the bird walk from that little breakfast nook, as well as the fireplace in Frank Lloyd Wright's home. Frank Lloyd Wright loved fireplaces. He felt that not only is it going to bring warmth physically into a space, but it's also going to invite people and bring warmth in that way. This little ingle nook next to the fireplace is something that was in all 3 versions of the living room at Taliesin. In this picture, you can also see sort of on the corner there by the edge of the couch is another statue. This is called a Guan Yin, and it is basically the female counterpart to a Buddha. Frank Lloyd Wright collected a lot of Buddha statues, and this one is sort of associated in that way. And this statue is what Frank Lloyd Wright referred to as a blossom of the soul. And what he meant by that was there were a lot of pieces of his art that were lost in the 2 fires and destroyed. But he fished them out of the rubble and put them back into his home. So this Guan Yin was one of those pieces. We think it was always in this spot in the living room. He would also take that a step further and embed some of the pieces into the walls themselves. There's a Buddha head embedded into the wall. There is a statue that lost all of its glaze, but he still put it in with it's a horse with a rider on it. So as we talk a little bit more about Taliesin, we'll see some more blossoms of the soul pop up. Here we have the guest bedroom. This was the main bedroom that Frank Lloyd Wright shared with his third wife, Olga up until the 1930s, when they decided to take separate but adjoining bedrooms. And so we'll see some views of that in a bit. And at that point, this became the guest bedroom when they moved over. You can see another big piece of art in there that Frank Lloyd Wright collected. We have another view of the guest bedroom looking into the next room we'll talk about, which is called the loggia. And we also have another blossom of the soul in this bedroom. It's actually the Guanyin statue, like the one in the living room, and this one is embedded in the wall. And you can see there is actually a beam of light that's hitting that statue. Frank Lloyd Wright redesigned, re-engineered the ceiling and the window above this statue over 20 times in order to get it so that twice a year on the equinox at 3 in the afternoon, a beam of light will come and hit the statue in the head. And so it goes to show you how actively Frank Lloyd Wright was experimenting with Taliesin, and also some of the ways that he incorporated nature into his home. So here is the blue loggia, called so because it has a lot of blue furniture in it. And loggia is an Italian term, again, that's basically talking about an indoor-outdoor living space, or kind of like a covered walkway. And what makes this a loggia is all of those windows along the back wall are actually doors. Those can all open up to the outside. And Frank Lloyd Wright really liked to blur the line between what's considered inside and what's considered outside. A lot of his outdoor spaces he considered to be rooms of his home. And so the blue loggia was a place where he could be both inside and outside at once when he opened up all of those doors. There's also some surprising gold color up on the area right there. That is an influence of Olgivanna. She had a slightly different design aesthetic from Frank Lloyd Wright, but this was her home as well, and so that was honored. Wright wasn't a huge fan of the gold initially, but he did mix it with the paint. He mixed with a wax to give it a little bit more of a natural looking texture, and after that he liked it a little bit better. We can also see there's a balcony up above, and that is where there's an apartment for Frank Lloyd Wright and Olgivanna's youngest daughter, Giovanna. So Frank Lloyd Wright actually adopted Olgivanna's daughter from her first marriage, and they had a daughter together. So altogether, with Frank Lloyd Wright's first wife, he had 8 children. Another view from back further in the loggia. This area is kind of called the pink loggia because of the pink furniture that's in there. And if the main part of the loggia with all of the windows could be considered an informal living room, then the pink loggia could kind of be considered a recreation space. He has a double harpsichord in that space, and in the 1950s, Wright actually purchased a television because he started to give a lot of interviews on TV, and he wanted to watch them. We also have another one of his art pieces. This one is another several hundred years old. It's from China, and it's in the style of an artist called Tang Yin, who is a very prominent Chinese artist. And whenever we have guests from China, they are very surprised to see this in Frank Lloyd Wright's living room because it was such a prominent art piece. Moving on through the loggia, you head into the room called the garden room, and the picture on the right with the blue plates are some more blossoms of the soul. They're actually ceramic roof tiles like you would find in Japanese homes, and so they extend a little bit into the stone itself. The garden room used to be where the driveway came through in Taliesin's 1 and 2. It was called the porte cochere, basically a carport, but for your horse and buggy. And Wright did not wall this in until the 1940s when he put in the garden court he put in the garden court outside in 1925, and he left it an outdoor terrace. And then in the 1940s, he decided he would like it to be a library, and that's when he walled it in. From here, you can see that he wanted it to be a library, so he added a lot of books in this space. And he also has a collection of seashells that were there during his lifetime. Frank Lloyd Wright loved seashells. He gave at least one lecture and an interview about seashells, and he talks about how they are things that we should study and learn from, because seashells are unique little homes for little creatures. They're very individual to the creatures who live in there, and they're very beautiful. And as humans, we have a tendency to design the same type of structures over and over and over again, even if they're not beautiful or make us feel good inside. And so we have a lot to learn from little creatures and from seashells. Here we have Olga Vanna's bedroom. This was where there was a guest bedroom originally. And Olga Vanna was someone that Frank Lloyd Wright met at a ballet. She was from Montenegro, spent a lot of time in Russia. And together, she helped Frank Lloyd Wright launch his fellowship in the 1930s. She was also pretty integral in keeping it running after his death, and she was the head of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation until she passed away in 1985. Olga Vanna was, like Frank Lloyd Wright, a writer and author. She published a few books as well. Some of them were about Wright and architecture, and some were more along the kind of self-help type theme. We can see some of her gold color up above the little triangle area in her room as well. Here we have a shot of Olga Vanna's bed, and I often get asked, is that really the size of her bed? And it really was. Everybody at Taliesin had a twin bed, including Frank Lloyd Wright. The bed that was in the guest bedroom is actually just two twins pushed together. We also have a close-up shot of some of the shelves that are cantilevered out of the side of the wall. And on the top of them, there is a green glass perfume bottle, which was actually key in helping us to preserve this space. Olga Vanna had made some changes in this room after Frank Lloyd Wright's life, because she did not pass away for another 25, 30 years or so. And our goal is to bring Taliesin back to the 1950s, where Frank Lloyd Wright was making decisions about how it looked. So there are only 7 pictures of her bedroom from the 1950s, and in one of them, they had both these shelves and the green glass perfume bottle. She had removed them at some point, so they were able to measure the perfume bottle and in the photo and then in real life to determine the scale of the photo. And then from there, they were able to recreate the shelves, which I just think is really cool because it's a little bit of detective work. Here we have Frank Lloyd Wright's bedroom, which looks a lot larger than Olga Vanna's, and that's because it is today, but originally, and for about 20 years of them sharing these separate but adjoining bedrooms, it was about the same size. Until there was a magazine that wanted to come and interview Frank Lloyd Wright. It was called Architectural Forum, and they'd actually been out to Taliesin before, so Wright wanted them to see something new and exciting that they hadn't seen before, and he directed his apprentices to add this space onto the bedroom. He gave them about 2 weeks to do it. So gives you a little bit of idea about what was happening at Taliesin. Beyond it being an experiment, it was also a place where Frank Lloyd Wright could show people his ideas and the things that he was trying to accomplish. In this photo, we can also see an interesting sculptural piece on the left-hand side toward the back, which is something that was given to Frank Lloyd Wright by some Italian architecture students. And it's actually for a gondola. It's called an oar lock. It's where the oar goes to steer the gondola. And Wright loved it because it's an example of something that's purely functional. It serves a very specific purpose, but it's also very sculptural and very beautiful at the same time. So he had this in his bedroom. This is also, the blue shag rug is also proof that Frank Lloyd Wright was far ahead of his time. This is the only original rug you can see at Taliesin these days, and he had it there in the 1950s. So we think of that as being a little later decades, but Wright did have that in his bedroom during his lifetime. Here's a view of Frank Lloyd Wright's bed. Like I said, just a twin bed. A lot of people are surprised by that. He was such a magnanimous character. He was so larger than life. For some reason, it's hard to translate that into having such a tiny little bed. But he also didn't spend a whole lot of time sleeping at night. He would often get up and design buildings if he had an idea, and then he would take naps throughout the day. We can see the skylight that was also installed above his little drafting table in his bedroom, along with that project that the apprentices did. And a little bit closer up view of the oarlock as well. Off of Frank Lloyd Wright's bedroom is a terrace. And here is a view of the terrace and looking out over the valley to kind of give you an idea of what Wright would have been looking at when he was hanging out on the terrace outside of his bedroom. Always bringing it back to nature. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to give himself a view out over the valley. He also gave himself a view out of his bedroom of some of the significant things on the landscape around him. He connected himself to his family, to his early architecture, just through the view he gave himself out of his bedroom. Moving on through the property, here is the Midway Barn Complex. And so Frank Lloyd Wright began this in the 1920s, about a decade after he built Taliesin initially. And this was the hub of his of his agriculture from the 1920s up through the end of his life. And the fellowship actually continued to use it into the 1960s. This was a place where all of his livestock would live. The tower that's on the left-hand side was the milk house, and that's where the cows would go to be milked, but it could only fit one cow at a time. So not super practical, but very beautiful. He also has a spire on top of that tower, and he referred to that as his ode to the Guernsey teat. So it's basically a cow's udder up there. And Frank Lloyd Wright preferred Guernsey cows because they're a nice reddish-brown color. He thought that the black and white cows, the Holsteins, look like crumpled up newspaper on the landscape. However, they produce more milk. So if you have to have them, keep them at the back of your property where no one can see them, and then put your Guernsey cows out front by the road. The stone pillars that you can see, if I can go back here, the stone pillars that you can see were originally supporting a roof. So this roof no longer exists, but there was one that came sort of from the barn, almost touching the ground, and that is where the cows lived, underneath that part of the barn. Here's sort of a more aerial view of the Midway Barn Complex, and you can see there's actually a little cottage up on the left-hand side. That was for the winter caretaker to be able to live, and there was a bridge going from that cottage to the main part of the barn so that in the wintertime they wouldn't have to go outside in order to help the animals, feed the animals, that sort of thing. Eventually, that bridge would become more housing for apprentices. They called it the train car because it was basically a train of beds all lined up in a row and separated by curtains. So it was pretty sparse living for some of the apprentices at Taliesin. All right, so the Hillside School and Drafting Studio is also part of the property, and this is something that was here well before Frank Lloyd Wright moved to the valley. His aunts actually inherited this property from his grandparents. So this was the original Lloyd Jones property. And when they passed away, they left it to their daughters, who were both teachers. So they decided to open up a school called the Hillside Home School, which operated from 1887 to 1914. And it no longer exists, but Frank Lloyd Wright's first independent commission as an architect was a building for the Hillside Home School. He tore it down himself in 1950, said it was obstructing his view, but I have a feeling it was just that he was sick of looking at it because it was a Victorian-style shingle-sided building. And Frank Lloyd Wright had moved on from that style of architecture. He felt that those Victorian-style buildings were too claustrophobic and didn't make you feel good inside. So he moved to what he eventually called the Prairie School of Architecture. And if you think about a lot of our ranch homes these days, kind of single-level, long, linear homes, they're very similar to what Wright was doing with Prairie-style homes. The building that we see at Taliesin today is the second building that Frank Lloyd Wright designed for the aunts, the Hillside Home School. And the photo on the left is the part of the building called the Assembly Hall. This part of the building was completed in 1902, and it's really the only portion of the 1902 building that still stands because there was a fire in this building as well in the 1950s. The area on the right-hand side with the spiky roof, that is the drafting studio that Frank Lloyd Wright added to Hillside in the 1930s when he began his fellowship. And a lot of people think those are solar panels up there. Frank Lloyd Wright was pretty advanced, but he wasn't quite that advanced. They're actually northern-facing windows that let light into the drafting studio from the north. Frank Lloyd Wright felt that northern-facing light was the best light to have in a space that you were doing artwork or drafting in because it's consistent throughout the day. So he wanted to provide that for his apprentices. Also on the property is a windmill called Romeo and Juliet, and this was something that Wright designed for the Hillside Home School as well. It was a way to pump water from a well, and there was a gravity-fed system from the windmill down to the school itself. The reason why it's called Romeo and Juliet is because of the two portions of the structure. There's the diamond-shaped portion on the left, that's Romeo, and all of the windmill equipment is in that space. And Juliet is the area on the right. It's an octagon shape that has a balcony on it, an overlook. And the role of Juliet is to support the Romeo portion of the building. It surrounds it and it keeps it stable. Frank Lloyd Wright's uncles tried to talk the aunts out of building Romeo and Juliet. They said it's a ridiculous design. It's going to fall over as soon as a heavy wind or a storm comes through the building, through the valley. And it's too expensive. It's about 3 times more than a regular steel windmill from the Sears catalog would have been. But the aunts knew that whatever they put on this hill for their windmill would be able to be seen throughout the valley. And they wanted something beautiful. And so Frank Lloyd Wright was able to convince them that this was safe to build, and he went through with it. And the reason why it is still so sturdy is because of the two portions of the structure working together to support each other. You can also see on the right-hand side picture that the diamond shape of Romeo actually extends into the interior of the windmill as well. And I have actually climbed to the top of this windmill. It was terrifying, but well worth it because it was a beautiful view out over the valley. All right, now we're heading inside Hillside, and this is the inside of the assembly hall. This is that 1902 portion of the building. We have a balcony that was where there was a library for the students, as well as a lot of light and a lot of windows. And Wright helped to open this space up by not having the balcony extend all the way to the windows. By putting it on these stone pillar supports, he was able to bring it into the room, and that creates some more light and some more movement throughout the space. Wright also put some little touches in here to help make it special for his aunts. That's actually part of organic architecture, is not just making sure a building fits in well with the site that it's on, but also to make it for the people who are going to be using it, and that was his aunts. So there is a Bible verse along the bottom of the balcony. It's hard to see in this photo, but that was his grandfather's favorite Bible verse. His grandfather was a Unitarian minister. This would have been very significant to him. We can also see on the right-hand picture the Celtic symbol called an awin. It's kind of like this, a three-pronged symbol. And this was something that the Lloyd-Jones family used to represent their family motto. Their family motto was truth against the world. Here we have the dining room that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in the 1950s after that fire. This was originally where there were some classrooms in the Hillside Homeschool building, but after the fire he decided to sort of suit it a little bit better to who was using the space at the time, which were his apprentices, and they needed a bigger space to dine. You can also see there are some evergreens inside. This was a Welsh tradition that Frank Lloyd Wright followed, and all year round he would bring branches of evergreens inside the space. The furniture was, of course, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I can attest it's about as comfortable as it appears, which is to say not very. But Frank Lloyd Wright was well aware that his furniture was uncomfortable. He said, if you're uncomfortable in it, you've been sitting for too long. We have a little bit closer view here of his chair that he designed, as well as some of the hanging lamps that can be found in the dining room. You might be familiar with the standing version of these lamps, and these were actually the precursor to those standing versions. Wright wanted to create a type of lamp where he could have indirect lighting. Wright is actually credited with the invention of indirect lighting, because this was a time period where if you had electricity, if you had lights, you wanted to show that off. You wanted your light bulbs to be visible, but Wright wanted it to look more natural, and so he has this indirect lighting by putting slats of plywood on top of where the light bulbs are to help kind of cast the light up or down depending on the space. In 1932, the fellowship began construction on the 5,000 square foot drafting studio that we saw from the outside. And this was where they would primarily work out of after it was completed. It took them about 7 years, so it was finished in 1939. And we have a theme in here of an abstract forest. Frank Lloyd Wright knew that a space that is this large, that is completely open, would be almost as uncomfortable as a space that was too claustrophobic. And so he provides a sense of safety and enclosure with what he calls an abstract forest. Going down the sides of the room, those triangular pillars represent the tree trunks, and above the trusses that are visible are the branches. The light also filters through those northern-facing windows we kind of saw from the outside, and it creates a dappled lighting effect like you're in the woods. It really does kind of feel like you're in a forest when you're in this space. We have a little bit closer up view of some of those pillars and the triangular motif you can see throughout the space. Wright designed all of the drafting tables and stools, and the triangles are also repeated on the bottoms of those pieces of furniture as well. The floor in this space is also very unique. It's made out of plywood, and it's basically 8 pieces of plywood stacked up. They sawed off the end to create a pinstripe effect, and the only other place you can see a floor like this is at the wing spread building Wright designed in Racine. Yeah, we are almost there. The Hillside Theater is something that was originally reconstructed out of what was the gymnasium for the Hillside Homeschool, and that portion of the building was affected by that 1950s fire, so he redesigned the theater that we see here today. He also incorporated his favorite tree on the property into the roof of the theater on the outside. He said he remembered his uncle planting a tree there when he was a child, and so he wanted to have the tree actually grow into the building itself. The theater seats about 100 people, and it's meant to be an immersive experience where the audience can see each other as well as what is happening on the stage. The curtain of the theater was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and also a surprise birthday present that the apprentices made for him when he was in his late 80s or early 1950s. And it's actually some very simple materials, but it's a very complex design. It's basically made out of muslin, yarn, and felt, and it represents the valley itself. The big black band on the left-hand side is the Wisconsin River. On the right-hand side, that green triangular diagonal is the hill that Taliesin is on. And all the way in the right-hand corner, you can actually see Taliesin off the side of the hill there. It's a view of the foyer of the theater. You can see another one of those music stands, as well as Frank Lloyd Wright's Walt Whitman quote that he included in the theater as well. I mentioned that Frank Lloyd Wright passed away in 1959. He was almost 92, and he never really retired. Our organization was set up in the early 90s to help preserve Taliesin with the help of Governor Tommy Thompson in order to continue Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy. And here is our building, the Riverview Terrace. This is the Frank Lloyd Wright Visitor Center, and originally would have been the gateway to Taliesin. This was something that Wright designed toward the end of his life, but unfortunately he passed away before it was completed. His apprentices completed this building in 1967, and it was opened as the Spring Green Restaurant, which a lot of people in this area have actually dined at, and I'm a little bit jealous because it looked like it was such a cool place to go. And that concludes our presentation here today about Frank Lloyd Wright and Taliesin. I hope you learned a little bit. I hope you were inspired a little bit, and I would absolutely welcome any questions that you might have. Yeah. Thank you. Somebody had a question over here.
What are your hours that you're open in your days?
Okay, yeah, so the question was, what are the hours that we're open and what are the days? We are actually opening back up for the season this Friday, and in May and November and the beginning of December, we're open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays from 10 to 4. And then from May through October, we are open 7 days a week, either from 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, depending on the time of year. And we'll be offering all of our tours at that point. Yeah.
And with your tours, do you see a number of the buildings, or are you just in the center?
Yeah, so the question was, do you see a number of the buildings on the tours, or are you just in the center? And we have 4 different types of tours. 2 of them go to just Taliesin, just the home and his personal studio. And 2 of them see more of the property. So we have a 2.5-hour tour called our Highlights Tour, which takes you to both Taliesin and the Hillside Home School and Theater. And we also have a 4-hour tour called the Estate Tour, where you get to see both of those as well as Wright's sister's home, Tanadery. So yeah, question.
When is the outdoor theater opening?
When is the outdoor theater opening? I think you might be talking about the American Players Theater.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure when they open, but I think it's around the same time we do, so hopefully pretty soon here. Yeah.
Is that restaurant still open?
Is the restaurant still open? In a sense, yes. We were actually able to open a cafe after COVID finally last year, and we're going to have the cafe again this year. Hopefully, eventually, we'll be able to extend that to dinner hours, but for right now, it's just going to be 11 to 3.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was there years ago.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it was cool.
Awesome. Other questions? Yeah.
So, are you aware of any work that Frank Lloyd Wright did in Cuba?
Right, that work that Wright did in Cuba. I am not. Did
We were trying to determine whose house we saw.
Oh.
They gave us a tour.
Oh.
We're not sure.
Interesting. I am not aware of anything he did in Cuba. That's not saying he didn't, but a lot of his apprentices did things internationally as well, and they had a very similar style to Frank Lloyd Wright. So it's entirely possible, if it wasn't a Wright building, that it was associated in some way. Yeah. Other questions? All righty. Well, thank you very much for coming out today. We have some maps over here if you would like to grab one of those, and I'll be around if you have any other questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, another big round of applause for her. She has a lot of information, and we really appreciate that. So thank you so much, Erin.